Now you've got a couple of decisions or choices to make with this, and we're going to back this up a second. Here's the hood sitting here. If you, I'll flip in the other direction, I think. We're going to pretend that here's the jacket, here's the front of it. When you cut it out, you seam line across the bottom, front edge of the jacket. When this is done, front edge of the hood, front edge of the hood. When this is done, you are going to have a casing. That hood is going to fold back on itself, and you are going to have a buttonhole that should then be centered in the middle of your casing there, that your drawstring will come through. And so we need to make the buttonholes before we sew this casing, because you can't get up inside that little tube to make a buttonhole. Okay? So one option you have is that this would just be like I showed you earlier. It would just be folded back, and your pattern actually had a little clip that said fold line here. It's 1 1/4 inches in. You would fold that back at 1 1/4 inches. When you sew it, you'll sew it 1/4, and your buttonhole should be marked in the center there. And so if you are not going to line your hood, and you're just going to fold that back, your buttonhole placement, see if this makes sense to you, you actually are going to measure in 1 3/4 inches from the front of your jacket, and then up 3/4 inch from the neckline of your jacket. You will start your buttonhole and send your buttonhole up towards the your casing that you're going to make. And then when it's all done and sewn, that buttonhole will sit right in the middle of the casing. So that's one option if you're just going to make the hood and have no lining. If you are going to flip this the other direction here, do like I have done here, and I'm going to make the hood and have a lining, but I'm going to have my lining recessed. My lining is actually going to, this pink would represent my lining here, so the casing of my hood will be the outside fashion fabric, and then the lining is going to be recessed. Okay? If that's the case, you would cut the hood out the same direction, and then the lining actually has to be trimmed further back. And so we'll measure and cut that back. But the buttonhole, when all is said and done, if you look at this, my buttonhole winds up in the very same place. It is 1 3/4 inch from the front edge of my jacket, or the front edge of my hood, and up 3/4 from the neckline edge. And so whether you are lining it with a recessed lining or choosing to not have a lining at all, your buttonhole will go in 1 3/4 inches and up 3/4 inch. Okay? Your third option, if you're going to line is lining your jacket, but having the lining meet the hood, or the lining for the hood meet the fashion fabric for the hood, literally right at the edge of the hood. In which case you would sew a 5/8 inch seam. If your pattern doesn't call for this, you will actually have to trim a little bit off the front of your jacket in order to choose this option. But if you do, you'll trim it so that what you have left, and if you look at this, you can see, is a 5/8 inch seam allowance to attach these. So you'll trim that a little bit. You've got that 5/8 inch seam allowance. Then when it's trimmed, before you've attached the two, you will now come back, and the measurement for the buttonhole for this is it's coming over 1 1/4 inch, and it still comes up 3/4 inch. Okay? So you come over 1 1/4 inch and up 3/4 if you are going to line your hood and have the lining of the hood meet right at the front of the hood rather than be recessed in that manner. So we've got to mark where our buttonholes are going to go. And because of the type that I've used, my buttonhole is going to come over 1 3/4 inches. So I'm going to stick a pin in, and it's going to come up 3/4 inch. So I just mark where the base of that buttonhole is going to start. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to come over 1 3/4 inch. Up 3/4 inch and mark the base of that. Okay. The reason we come up 3/4 of an inch, your seam allowance is 5/8. That gives you 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of your buttonhole to your neckline when the time comes, because we don't want the buttonhole to get lost in your neckline seam. And so you want to come up have that 1/8 of an inch at the base of that. And then we will be ready to put the buttonholes in. The first thing we're going to do is grab a scrap and make a couple of practice ones to make sure that we're making decent buttonholes. Now, you will put your buttonhole foot on your sewing machine. The one other thing that we've got to do when we make buttonholes on a knit, the fabric, and we've talked about this before, tends to grow as you sew. So as you're making your buttonhole, it will actually tend to elongate your fabric or stretch it as you sew, because the buttonholes are sewn with such a tightly zigzag stitch that becomes a satin stitch together. So we have to stabilize this fabric and kind of trick the sewing machine into thinking it's sewing on something more stable. So you will take just a piece of woven fabric, and this actually just happens to be a piece of woven interfacing that I'm going to use. And I'm going to put this behind my fabric so that when I make that buttonhole, it actually is sewing through a woven fabric as well to help stabilize it. Okay. Push the 0 on your pad there so that your machine knows that it's going to make a buttonhole. And a good size for a buttonhole is about 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch. And if you look at your little buttonhole foot, there's a little teeny tiny red mark where my fingernail is sticking right here. And then there is a red slide that moves up and down. And so you will measure from that red mark to the red slide for 1/2 an inch. And then as you start to sew, begin stitching and stitch until the red slide and the red mark line up with each other. When you get to that point, just push your reverse button. Whoops, not that hard to push it over. The machine will make the end. It will sew back to the beginning of the buttonhole and make the bar tack. So the second side of the buttonhole, the end, and it will actually stop when it's done. Bring your needle up. Okay. Now, until you tell the machine otherwise, it will continue to make buttonholes that size. It's always a good idea to make a second one just to make sure that the machine really did remember what it's supposed to be doing. So I'm just going to move over just a little bit so I'm still on my little scrap of fabric behind there. I'm just going to push down on the foot, make sure that the machine remembers what it's doing. And that's in memory, and so now I will come to my jacket and make my buttonholes in my hood. Most common mistake that is made when putting in the buttonholes is they bring their hood to the students bring the hood to the sewing machine and they get confused as to the direction of the hood. This is the front of the hood. You remember you sewed the curve around the back of the hood? And so this is the front, this is where your face is going to be. And you want that buttonhole to go parallel to the front edge of the hood. The most common mistake is they come over here and get confused which direction they're facing, and they get the buttonhole facing the other direction. So be sure you lay your hood out and that you've got what's considered to be the front of your hood and that you line that up correctly there. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take that piece of interfacing, put it behind where my buttonhole is going to go, and I'm going to make sure that that straight unnotched edge, the front of my hood, is lined up parallel to the edge of my sewing machine here. Okay, my notched edge is behind here so that I'm actually going to sew the buttonhole up the right direction. And then where the pin went in, where I poked that pin into my fabric, is right where I'd like the center of the buttonhole to be. So I kind of look underneath the foot, drop my needle down, make sure I'm good, pull the pin out. Do not try to make that buttonhole with the pin in place there. Drop the presser foot. And then do the same thing on the other side. Okay, notice when I do the second side, that front edge is now on the outside of my presser foot. Okay. But it is still aligned with the sewing machine that direction. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to drop that needle in right where my pin poked into my fabric. Take my needle out, drop the presser foot, and start my second buttonhole. And you've got 2 buttonholes made. Before you cut them open, make sure that they are heading the right direction, which they are. Make sure that you are 1 3/4 inches in my case, and 3/4 inch up, that they are placed correctly, because once you cut them open, you can't uncut them. So when you're sure they're placed well, then we'll cut open the buttonholes. And before you cut open your buttonhole, please be sure you put a pin across the end of the buttonhole. You can use a seam ripper to cut open the buttonhole. Just put your seam ripper down right near the end of the bar tack, straight through the hole, and then very carefully cut to the other side. The reason that pin is there is it does not allow me to cut too far and cut across the end of the buttonhole. And then you can come back and get just that last little piece that you couldn't with the pin, and then your buttonhole will be cut open. At this point now, we don't need all that extra fabric that is sitting back there, and so go ahead and trim out the extra fabric that is around that buttonhole and trim your threads, and then we'll be ready to attach the lining to the hood and make the casing.